Julie, why don't you go ahead and take it away and kind of set the context for the session and let everybody introduce themselves.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kent. And welcome, everybody. Michael, Trevor, and Aishagal. I'll let you guys all do your introductions, but I just wanted to introduce myself first. My name is Julie Smithson. I've been here most of the day and really proud to be a part of this particular panel, Designing for the Bigger Picture. And my role at Metaverse as co-founder, and I also run a lot of the operations in the back end and working with the clients and trying to prepare both my teams as well as the client teams to design for WebXR. There's certainly a wild storyboard in front of us to be able to build these immersive experiences and making sure that they're optimized for the use case that they're being built out for. So hopefully I can give some of my expertise in this particular conversation, but I'll pass it over to Trevor and he can do his introduction from where his perspective is coming from. Thanks for being with us, Trevor.
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, thanks for having me on the panel. So yeah, I'm Trevor Flowers. My background is varied. I started working with VRML back when it was sort of a plug-in from Sun to render inside browsers that really didn't know how to do 3D. I've worked on a couple of web browsers, most recently the Firefox Reality browser from Mozilla, which is running on the Pico and rumored to run on the Lynx soon. And then right now I am an industrial designer for a small studio in Seattle called Transmutable. Yeah, and I have a project called Potassium ES, which is sort of a responsive and dynamic progressive library for XR.
Amazing, amazing. Michael, how about you?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael DiBenigno. I'm head of business here at Flow Immersive. I like to say that I'm a recovering management consultant, making up for all the presentations and PowerPoints I've given in my life. And really saw Flow as this next iteration of how we more effectively communicate with data at its core. I guess sort of on the sort of side notes or related to Flow, I'm also known as the data guy on TikTok, where we've grown 100,000 followers. I mean, I think it points towards this idea of how XR can span across devices, and really excited to talk more about that. But that's been really key, I think, to our growth and the adoption of XR at Flow. And prior to my time as a consultant, was at MIT for my MBA. So I've always sort of played at this intersection of technology and business.
Amazing. Thanks for being with us today. And my good friend Aishagal Yönet, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me. It's so nice to be part of this event again. So my name is Aishagal. I worked at Microsoft as a cloud developer advocate for AI and spatial computing. I'm also the co-chair of Immersive Web W3C working and community group, took the baton from Trevor. And yeah, I actually started, well, I was trained to be a graphic designer. I moved to 3D visualizations and I loved it. And afterwards I start developing. So I have a journey from being a designer from 2D to what I'm doing today, building things for mixed reality.
Amazing.
For Trevor's introduction, I wanted to point out one other thing. He's the editor of Immersive Web Weekly.
That's right.
Yeah.
He definitely is. And if you aren't signed up for it, it does come out and it's quite informative. Thank you very much, Trevor, for producing that. There's a lot of things to learn out there. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Sure. I mean, I just point at what great work other people are doing. So I love to do it.
And speaking of great work, today the sessions about designing have been all over the place, but so informative. And I feel like our panel here today is kind of the summary, a little bit of summary of everything that was kind of going on today. I know from my perspective and where I start with my clients when designing for that bigger picture, obviously it's figuring out what are we designing for? What is that purpose? Is it marketing, training? What are we creating? And, then again, what does that design look like? Is it and from my perspective, it's mobile. So, is it a landscape or a portrait view? And then, diving deeper into that, into VR or mixed reality. But it always starts with storyboarding. And maybe we can just go around and talk about the importance there, because I know that's something that it's a little bit hard for our clients to come up with those ideas of storyboarding, and they're used to the 2D graphics tools. And I know we're going to talk in a couple of minutes with Aishagul about, how do you move from 2D to 3D design tools, but storyboarding, maybe if each of you want to give a little bit of your insights on how you work with your clients to come up with some of these designs to help them understand, what are we designing? What are we building? What is it going to look like? Because it's really hard to see it before it's actually designed. Trevor, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it was really difficult, right? As a traditional designer, I was really used to writing scenarios and taking those into user flows, which are, 2D sort of linear, step-by-step descriptions of user interactions and what they were seeing. So when working with clients who were used to that workflow, but trying to convey to them sort of the spatial relationship between things, and that it's not necessarily this linear page-to-page flow, but it's sort of it's an environmental dynamic thing. We very quickly, I used to run a small design firm, and so we were very quickly switched over to just using as quickly as possible sketches in VR. And there are some great tools for that, especially now. So Blender actually now has a VR preview mode. And so recently I've started sort of quickly assembling sort of the equivalent of, in games, they would call it like the gray box of a scene or an interaction, which is basically just literally boxes of things that give the basic shape of something, and then putting the client in the VR headset in Blender VR mode, and then they can actually see it, inside the immersive headset. And that changes a lot of the way that they immediately can pick up on a lot of the cues that if they hadn't seen it in 3D, they wouldn't understand what was happening at all.
What about you, Aishagul? What about some design tools and things that you're using for storyboarding?
We are using 3D storyboarding tools as well as using Unity as well. But I'm lucky to be working with people who are mainly designers for mixed reality. I mean, if I was working in a WebXR environments, maybe just with the web designers, there will be a totally different experience. And previously, I actually worked on Autodesk. We were creating a tool for designers, and it was being used, and the designer was sitting just right next to us. And it was a very complicated process, because if you think about storyboarding, it comes from the animation or movie industry, and you have still frames, and that's what I was used to. But now you have to consider so much more. Like, there's just so many iterations, right? If I'm using a AR glass, for example, and I'm looking at a different direction than where I'm supposed to look at, like, we have to consider all of these things, and like what is in my environment too, which is really complicated. I don't have a success story, honestly.
What about you, Michael? How do you use storyboarding?
Yeah, so for my 2 cents, I think some of the core elements of any sort of engagement or project still remain, which is who's the audience, what's the core message they're trying to convey. If there's one thing that they're going to remember at the end of whatever experience or presentation, what is that action you're trying to drive? And I think those are sort of critical and easily overlooked by sort of the cool, I'm going to go into XR, but I think it's so fundamental, and it sort of doesn't matter what medium that is a part of. And so I actually really do want to people start just like a piece of paper, like, let's just like identify some of these things. And as you go through that storyboarding process, I think it helps to codify, how you really want to convey this message. And I think too often you can get lost in some of the details. Now, one thing I'll add, which I think you guys all sort of mentioned, which is that we're transforming from this like 2D slide world into more of an immersive space. And I often find that the hardest thing about learning flow is not learning the tool itself, but it's how do I think in a more in a way that sees sort of the forest and the trees, that you can see the big picture, but then zoom in or drill into some of those details. And I think that thinking of how I can create a story that show those interconnected parts is actually the harder part of learning, at least our software. But I think the way you get there is still sort of some of those fundamentals of like, you still need a strong story, compelling narrative, and you shouldn't let the wanderingness that you can do in XR sort of detract from that.
Well, it even starts with the brand, right? So I'm dealing with some clients who are just, how do you transform your 2D brand into a 3D world? And I heard somebody else talking about this a little bit earlier today, and I've been working with my clients to help them put together a 3D branding playbook now. They had a 2D one. Everybody knows that, from how do you, where do you put the logo on your website or, your business card or whatever it is. But it's definitely a different level of consideration when you're planning to have your brand in a spatial environment. What does that logo look like from this side of the screen or that side of the screen? And then color palettes is actually a really big challenge, because they've got all of these colors that they normally have, but when the world's changing behind that particular scene, they have to have another color palette behind it. It sounds very, very simple to fix, but when it has to go through an organization to get approvals of these things, it takes time. And as I said, some clients are having to rebuild, rethink, what their brands actually look like in this different perspective. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on or is working with any challenging brand stories.
I mean, I've had some luck reframing the conversation as if it was them commissioning a physical good. So, like sometimes it's a sign for a building, that's sort of the equivalent in their head. They're like, oh, we have to take into account the environment around the sign and how much light it's emitting and how it looks in the day and the night and how it is against the background. And so sometimes reframing the conversation around sort of industrial design tactics that have been around for hundreds of years has been helpful. But when it comes to the dynamic parts of that, then it all falls down, right? Because your sign isn't going to like rocket off into space and then orbit the moon and then come back, and it falls down a little bit at that point.
I think that's part of managing expectations with the client.
Sure.
And mapping out, where they're entering this place of XR and where they want to go to. And again, it all comes back to educating the client. I know, just talking about a client and saying, okay, if you build out a mobile experience, it's okay. We can evolve from that. We can make it into a VR experience, and they don't know that. So it's part of that educated process with the clients to help them understand that they can grow from where they are as long as it's being built to scale, right? So great. Trevor, I know that you, we were talking a little bit more about the wider web. And maybe we can jump into that conversation, because I know Michael's also got some insight as well from Flow Immersive, how that can be tied to the wider web. Do you want to take off with that particular conversation?
Sure. So the problem that I was trying to solve was how to wrap my head around, as a designer, the complexity of all of the decisions that go into making a web-oriented experience. And so one of the key differences between a web-oriented experience and something that's for a specific headset, or even that's just for Portal AR, it's an AR experience on the iPhone, is that it has to be dynamic and responsive. So, a single user will, if they pop into their immersive browser in a VR headset, they'll start off the experience in a flat, on a flat web page, and then they'll click a button that eventually opens it up into VR, and they might go back and forth between that several times. And then when you add in, the fact that the website has to handle basically 3 entirely different display modes, that alone is complex enough. But then when you have all the new control types, so you can have like your regular 2D page controls like most people make now. You have overlay controls that, if you're looking through your your device. You have things that sort of are on the surface. Those are your overlay controls. And then within the space, you have spatial controls. So that's, the exponential curve of complexity that the designer has to deal with is growing over time. And then you add on top of that gestures and, tracked wands and speech input and eye tracking and all the different new input types. It is radically overwhelming. The difference between designing a 2D flat web page, the kind of thing, like if you were making a to-do list, that's maybe 100 or so design decisions for making like a unique to-do list on a web page. But you make that sort of responsive and progressive across all of this new hardware and modes, that's thousands and thousands of designs. So it just became very clear to me that we couldn't do that repeatedly for every web page or even every widget, or, that's just not a thing that we can wrap our minds around, that level of complexity. So the idea of the wider web is that we slot these things into buckets, and then we build up a library underneath it that sort of makes a lot of the decisions for us, sort of in the same way that we have CSS frameworks that we use, or we have UI frameworks like React, or Vue, or like those. How as designers can we start from something that our brains can actually wrap our minds around? And so the wider web, it basically has 3 different parts to it. It has 3 display modes: flat, portal, and immersive. 3 control types: page, overlay, and spatial. And then sort of a abstraction layer over the inputs that converts low-level inputs like button presses or eye tracking gaze information, or even environmental information like stuff from the depth cameras, converts those into higher level actions. So as designers, we would write basically the script that says, okay, for these lower level actions, let's turn those into these sort of abstract higher level actions that then get sort of put into the system so the user knows how to do it, so that we don't have to rewrite those input translations every single time we make an app. So that was the goal. It's just, how do we even think about this complexity? So that was where the wider web started.
And I think Oren DePanther just commented, working based on capabilities instead of building for the specific devices, because we all know how quickly the devices change. We're looking at a couple of new devices each year, and being able to optimize and keep going and supporting all of these different devices all the time, it can plain and simply be exhausting, right? So building for capability first.
Sure.
Yeah. Michael, did you want to jump in there?
Yes, definitely. So I think that, the wider web, to me, I feel like there's really been this push towards the metaverse. And I think the wider web and what we're talking about here all fit together. And we've sort of been, talking about this over and over and over within the WebXR community, that one of the key attributes is that it's cross-device. It works across platforms natively. And I think more and more the XR world is starting to embrace this idea that what we're solving can not only be solved in XR, but often can be solved in 2D counterparts. And if we think about it more as a progression, that this is a series of devices that you can join or be part of, that's what you're doing. And that, at the end of the day, Flow Immersive is a data storytelling company, not a XR company. And I think that's a really important distinction. XR is an enabling technology, but it is not the definition of what you solve for or what you do. And so on that front, I think we're just super well positioned. Like WebXR is just so well positioned for this idea of the metaverse. How do we, have cross-platform experiences, but don't just regulate things to only be XR. And I think that's just so fundamental. And just as a quick visual for that, we output basically these data stories, and those data stories can both have just a live link, so you can just send someone a link and they can go through it by themselves. We can actually have a live multi-user meeting. Actually, what I'm doing right here, if I click this button, this is live. This is a live meeting. And so we're in a meeting right now, but literally everyone could just grab their phone, point it to that QR code, and you can join this other meeting that we're part of. And that idea of that we're simultaneously on a 2D flat screen meeting, but then can also go into a 3D world on your phone or device, and that cross intersection between all of them. I think that's where things all lie, because let's just be honest, like majority of people are not necessarily going to jump into XR right now to go in for a meeting. I think us being on a 2D thing right here is sort of testament to that. And I think that's just inevitable. And I think it's a progression of how we get there, not just like a all or nothing. And so the last component here of these AR videos, initially we created these AR videos just as a way to show what does it look like or feel like in XR, but it became a product in and of itself. And I think that product in and of itself was really just part of the metaverse, that people want sort of those different connection points. So I think that the wider road is just so fundamental here, and really excited to see more conversation around it. And I see some people join my meeting too. So that's cool.
Amazing. Aishagul, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I'm sure, Michael, you have the same issue too. Like when we were creating a 3D viewer at Autodesk, one thing that we quickly realized is that it's not just having 3D model that has lots of details where you can explore in many, many ways. But people are used to something like a slideshow, right? In 2D, they want to go from one thing to another. If you just give them the experience, here you go, there's a 3D object in front of you, go explore, people usually don't know what to do about it. And navigating them to the experience was very interesting. I'm sure you're going through the same thing with the data visualization. Have you guys found any solution, or Michael?
Yeah, what we've learned on that front is that we initially built the platform with the idea that you can sort of go anywhere. Like choose your own adventure, choose your own story. Click this button, go onto this step. You sort of want to drill in and explore. And actually, it's one of the most requested things that we get still. But what we learned is that while people think they want that, at the end of the day, they actually still want a story, which is often linear. And so how we have sort of played that line is that we give people sort of basically a very basic like next and back button to progress the story along, but that within each step, you have the ability to click into more detail or filter or do other things to help tell the story. And I have this animation going in the background here, but that's sort of how I think we got beyond it. But I think that is a really strong, the big difference between what people think they want and what they actually want sometimes is very apparent there. And we're all moving from that 2D slide world into a world where it could be more integrated, but you still need a story that is, does have some linear components to it.
And I think the other key point is collaboration too, and being able to see things that maybe another person can see at the same time or contribute to at the same time. And coming back to the storyboarding, one of the tools that we use right now just to try and kick things off with the client is Miro. A lot of people have heard of Miro before, and you can put those 2D pieces on there, but you can collaborate with your clients and start to build out what they're looking for, and then take that and lift that off into whichever engine or platform you're going to use. But the collaboration piece helps with perspectives. And I think that's another key word, right? Flow Immersive gives you visual perspectives of data, and just like all the other experiences that we're building out there. So it's certainly, I can see us using more things like Miro or collaborative workspaces where people can start to contribute to the story together. And and then it becomes, adding that dose of spatial in there will lift these experiences off into whether it's a mobile or a VR or a mixed reality experience. But maybe Aishagul, are there any tools that you well, I know we had this conversation. How do you lift off from 2D tools into 3D tools? And maybe if you want to give some insight there on how you're dealing with things in your teams to tell that story.
Yeah, sure. So Microsoft is a big company, as you can imagine, and we have some design systems already in place. And we would like to have a similar design system for mixed reality. But when we go with that problem to our designers, they just want to use Photoshop and design everything in 2D. While there's a wrong way of starting how to design, but at the same time, if you're doing it on a 2D environment, you are missing out a very important thing. Everything is still a square button. Whereas you might have a globe or something where you can use different parts of it as buttons, or you can have different interactions, and it's really hard to make that switch and not to go directly to the tools that you are used to. And but there are some parts of visualization that especially requires both of them. For example, data visualization. I mean, before you go directly into 3D design for data visualization, you have to look at your data. And usually those are the tools that people are using, like Tableau and such. Instead of directly going there, I would definitely use some data visualization tool like that to see, like, what am I missing? What can I add with the, maybe the third dimension?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that piece, which is, I think one other thing we're starting to learn, is that part of the idea of like collaboration, or why we meet, is that live aspect. It's like, if we're just going to sit back and sort of just listen only, it's like, well, we don't really need to be live. Let's just watch the video. There's no need to be part of it. And I think what we've been finding, and I'm just showing this example where it looks like I still have some people in that meeting, that's what we found is that you can even just like see what someone's looking at, and that's actually very powerful. Or that I can click on something and that is highlighted for everyone. It's these small interactions that we're starting to enable that are actually making it way more interactive, way more engaging. But I think it's also enabling non-experts to help communicate, or someone that doesn't feel necessarily comfortable, stopping the presenter and asking about that last slide, that literally can just point to something and be like, hey, what's this? Like, what's going on in that city? And that's a very empowering moment. I think that's something that XR is really enabling there.
Yeah, absolutely. Trevor, anything else you would like to contribute? I'm just watching our time. We've got just another minute or so, and then go ahead.
Sure. I wanted to shout out to an earlier panelist's work, Zach Capalbo, I think is how you say his last name. He is working on this thing called Vartiste. I think that's right. And it's basically, it started off, I think, mostly as a 2D, you're in VR, but you're making a two-dimensional painting. But over time, it has evolved, I think, as a good way for 2D artists to get in. And then he's adding more and more tools so that you can take 2D gestures of the kind that a painter or an illustrator would be used to, and then making them into 3D objects that are in the environment with you. So he has, if you find his Twitter, he has incredible examples of using brushes that basically translate flat ideas into 3D. So I am super excited about this tool for design and for communicating with people. I can't wait until I get to use it with a client, because there is multi-user mode. So yeah, I wanted to point people at Zach's work, because it's I think it's sort of an indicator of the future of the kind of design tools that we'll be using a lot more of in the future.
Amazing. So I guess in summary, because I know Kent's coming on right now, the lessons from our talk are visualization, collaboration, right? And different perspectives. Anything else?
I would say telling a story too, not just giving the information, but also directing the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think also on that front, I think there is still this fantasy, especially in the data world, that like, I'm going to throw my data into 3 dimensions, and suddenly like every insight is just going to sort of flow into me, and it's just going to all become clear. And unfortunately, that's not quite how things work still. But once you identify that story, or you identify the thing you want to highlight, it is a very effective medium by which to communicate. And I think that's sort of the emphasis, and story is still involved there. It's I think we the whole idea of just exploration only, I think, is starting to lose some momentum there.
Amazing. Thank you so much for contributing today into this panel and designing for the bigger picture. I really appreciate you joining us, and thanks very much.
Thank you
I
for
think we
having
have got our next
Yeah.
our next
Thank
panel
you so
coming
much.
in.
me. Bye.
All
Thanks,
right.
Julie.
Thanks, Julie.
very
Thanks,
much,
everybody.
guys.